So welcome back to the forum for the second session where we're going to tackle the important topic of grid planning, linking the issue related to risk and policy decision from the use of scenario, in particular long-term energy scenarios. As you know, of course, it is now widely accepted that in our field that transmission and distribution infrastructure has become the central bottleneck of the energy transition. For years, our focus was to make renewable cost competitive, and IRENA data shows we largely succeeded. Now, the challenge is shifting to delivery, to building the essential pathways that bring the clean energy from where it is generated to where it's needed. The long-term scenarios, long-term energy scenarios are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And we'll see that in the session, at mapping where and when new grid capacity is needed. However, a map is always wrong. And a map of future systems is not a business plan. Investors, whether they are private, public-private, require a different set of signals. Clarity on which specific corridors will advance, how network tariffs will be structured, and most importantly, how do you adjust risk allocation among stakeholders? This challenge was actually the central finding in the consultation in the run-up to the formation of the Global Coalition for Energy Planning, which we are co-hosting with our chair, the government of Brazil. We heard consistently during this consultation, including from the financial community, that they need three things to deploy capital at scale. The first is speed, particularly in permitting. The second is about certainty through stable policy frameworks. And the last but not least, bankability, which comes also from transparent risk allocation. The session will address these gaps heads-on. The central question we ask the panelists and people that are going to intervene is how do we translate the economic case for grid expansion, which our scenario demonstrates quite well, into the investment case required by the financial and actors. To set the scene and to provide concrete perspective on this challenge, we'll begin with two scene-setting presentations. The first one will be from my very dear colleague, Gayatri Nair, who will share global experiences and lessons on delivering large-scale grid infrastructure. And the second will be from Brazil with Luca de Oliveira from the Brazil EPE, the Energy Research Office, who will share the experiences, the world-class experience with transmission auctions. With that, I'd like to invite Gayatri to the lectern.
Thank you, Simon, and good morning to everyone here. I was listening into the session in the morning, and it was a very insightful one. And I hope this presentation and the one after and this session will also bring a lot of insightful discussions. I don't think I need to talk about this, so I'll go on to the first slide of mine. So my presentation today will actually draw from one of our IRENA reports, which is titled as Delivering Large-Scale Grid Infrastructure Projects. This was delivered by UNESA, which is the Utilities for Net Zero Alliance, which is an initiative from IRENA. And also will have information that come from our costing report, from our tracking of renewables report, and other data sources. So what I intend to discuss here is to set the scene, like very rightly said by Simon, as to how the progress in renewables have been happening, what kind of investments have been happening, but why do we see that lagging behind in grid infrastructure projects? So we'll take a look at what are the essential challenges in delivering and deploying grid infrastructure projects, and what can be done to make things easier for us. So in the past few years, as you can see, the renewable capacity has been growing and it has set new records in 2024. Amongst this, solar PV additions have been significant and it accounted for most new additions, whereas wind has also been growing. And there has also been growth in technology enablers like storage. Both batteries and pump storage have seen capacity additions, but evaluations still show that the grids need to be refurbished or added to by almost 80 million kilometers. Of course, this data is from 2022, but I believe there are not much changes in this, and we need to almost double what is as of now. Sorry, I think I skipped one slide. Sorry, I have to go back to the previous slide. Can Gavin help me here on slide 4? Yeah, here. Thank you. So if you take a look at investments, investment in renewable power capacities have grown, investment in battery storage has grown. At the same time, grid infrastructure investment has only shown a very modest growth. And strategic investment in modernizing and expanding the grids, as well as inclusion of new technologies or technology enablers, have to be done to enhance energy security. So we foresee that electricity grids will require substantial funding to adjust to the new power generation mix. So we've seen what renewable capacity additions have been done, what are the kind of investments that have been done. Now let's take a look at the cost. So we've seen that the cost of renewables have declined, and they remain the most competitive option for new electricity generation, with almost 91% of the newly commissioned utility scale capacity delivering power at a lower cost than any of the newly installed fossil fuel initiative. But in countries where grid investments and system integration measures are not keeping pace with rapid deployment, there are issues which crop up like curtailment. As everybody knows, everybody here in this room knows what curtailment is. We see curtailment as a challenge even in developed economies. According to the Bundesnetzagentur, Germany actually doubled curtailment in the last year as compared to the values in 2023. And this is not only in Germany, it has been seen globally as well. Additionally, grid connection queues are a problem, or it still persists as a problem. And there is, solar PV remains the most dominant technology which is waiting for grid connection, representing a majority of renewable capacity in advanced stages, followed by wind. So delayed grid development will also increase the risk of outages, which are economically damning. So let's move on to why the challenges are for large-scale grid projects to be delivered. Even though the growth in renewables are a good sign, investment in renewables are a good sign, we must see more investment happening in large-scale grid infrastructure projects. You know that the time that is taken for grid infrastructure projects to be deployed, from the planning to the permitting, it almost takes more than 10 to 15 years, as compared to the renewable projects, which are far lesser or shorter time frames. So what is the difficulty that is causing this, or what is the challenge that is causing this delay? For one, they are complex undertakings. They involve a lot of significant financial investment, and they need extensive planning and coordination of multiple stakeholders. Though these projects are very critical for economic growth and energy sustainability, they are often subject to delays and cost overruns. Building out grids requires secure supply chains and skilled workforce as well. Some evaluation, what about the emerging markets and developing economies also highlight that land procurement is an issue, and also the financial stability of or financial viability of the utility is a big issue. So we need to develop projects which reduce financing costs and improve bankability. So how should planning be adopted, or what is the kind of planning that we need to go to or take up when we are considering grid projects? So some key points that I would like to highlight here is planning should become more comprehensive. It should shift from a project-by-project approach to a more programmatic approach, looking and incorporating the expectations of the new type of generation, the new demand, as well as cross-border developments that happen. So it should be part of a broader, forward-looking, holistic, and coordinated national and regional plan. Stakeholder engagement is very essential, and it should start very early in the process. Identifying and addressing permitting or approval challenges are very important. Reducing the lengthy processes are key for early delivery of projects. And regulations need to be reviewed and updated, not only to support the deployment of new grids, but also to improve the use of the existing assets. So in the previous slide, I mentioned stakeholders, and since I come from a very system operation background, I would like to introduce what is important or what is key as one of the key stakeholders that you should be engaging with. I think this is known to everybody, but I would like to stress on it and why they are important. The system operator role, I think nobody will argue, is one of the key stakeholders for planning. And engaging them is crucial because they have a very deep understanding of how the system dynamics will evolve over time with the new kind of generation, the new demand, and the new kind of end-use sector, end-use sector electrification that is happening. So that's something key that they should be engaged very early in the process. The second is we always talk about transmission system operators, but the key is also to involve distribution system operators because they have insights also to provide on how the grids could look going forward. The regulators who are issuing the permits should also be included in the conversation from very early stages. And one important aspect that they can offer, that grid operators and regulators can offer, is to ensure that the most cost-effective solutions will be identified and prioritized, which will reduce the system cost at large. So ensuring business case is something which I think this entire session is devoted to. How can you ensure that there is a business case for grid development and therein support its deployment and faster growth? So the challenge that large grid infrastructure projects face is the upfront cost and long payback periods, higher interest rates, uncertainty around the geopolitical risk, cost of capital, increased cost of capital, all of this affects the business case. So financial barriers that can be addressed is driving targeted, how can you address the financial barriers is to have targeted grid funding and increase cost transparency. You can also include modify the way that the utility operators or the utility companies are remunerated. So to ensure that there is a stable and forward-looking regulation put in place, and thus ensuring anticipatory or not only supporting anticipatory investments, but providing long-term predictability to investors. Another very important aspect is to ensure that the business case is very system specific. That means you cannot adopt or adapt the business case proposals that are meant for other systems, but it should be very, very system specific, which is which should be based on feasibility studies and ensure that the investor can actually get returns of investment. Of course, reducing capital cost and also enhancing the planning regulatory risk assessments will also allow financing to become more easier for the projects. So this is from me. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have.
Thank you, Gayatri, for this summary. And of course, we'll make sure that the publication you mentioned from IRENA and UNESA are available for all participants of the forum. I'd like now to invite Luca de Oliveira from EPE on the national experiences in transmission auctions. Luca, the floor is yours.
Well, hello everyone. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank for the invitation. It was a great presentation previously, so it already set the stage for some of the experiences that I will share with you today from Brazil on turning grid planning into bankable pipelines. I work at EPE. EPE is a public company directly linked to the Ministry of Mines and Energy. Our main mandate is to provide the ministry with technical studies to subsidize the decision-making process and public policies. So the presentation is very brief. I'd just like to share you some key highlights. So we have a maestro at EPE. It's the 10-year expansion plan. We do that yearly. We revisit the premises, the trajectory, and it integrates all the players, the transmission, the generation, oil and gas demand, into a single product that takes a holistic view on the grid planning on all sectors. In the last edition, we have 30,000 kilometers of new transmission lines and around 82,000 megawatts in substation already planned for the next decade that are already contracted or waiting the right moment to take that already studied solution and start turning into the procurement auctions. And it's a joint work between the Ministry of Mines and Energy, that's responsible for the policy making, EPE, that's responsible for the studies, the planning, the ONS, the transmission system operator in Brazil. So we have two separate entities for planning and for operation, and ANEL, the regulatory institution. So our long-term scenarios don't end on paper, they end at substations with investors on site. So we have this auction model in Brazil for 25 years, so it's been pretty successful, and in the recent years, it came in handy with the expansion of renewables because we can fast track projects, and it takes around 5 to 7 years of worst case scenarios for a solution to come into operation in Brazil. And transmission utilities have incentives to energize and bring into operation earlier. So the transmission auctions are the main procurement mechanism for contracting new capacity in Brazil. We have around 207 billion reais. That's around 43 billion euros in transmission investments in the last 10 years in Brazil. And it's a public planning, a centralized planning on transmission side, but private capital and clear risk allocation is key to that bridge. So another highlight is the environmental screening. Brazil is a huge country. This is the northmost part of Brazil. Manaus, it's a capital of one of our states. It has around 2 million people living there. And you can see that it does not have a scale, but there are huge distances, are over 1,000 kilometers. So I checked before, it's greater than the northernmost point of Germany to the southernmost point. So all these solutions were studied at EPE, and we have environmental constraints like indigenous land that you can see there in purple and conservation areas. So we have to take that into account since the beginning, since the conception of the alternatives to choose the best one, not only looking for transmission solutions, but the holistic view, the environmental ones, and the long-term scenarios and needs of the region. So environmental screening identifies priority corridors and no-go zones before the auction stage, reducing licensing risks. We have coordination with IBAMA, that's the federal environmental agency, and state agencies to mitigate the risks and some potential conflicts. We do not do the licensing prior to the auction, but we do have talks, we do have studies, preliminary studies, to mitigate the risks and to map out the main problems or challenges that the investors might find out later. And we do tailor-made reports for each asset prior to the auction. So we do social environmental route analysis and preliminary land cost estimates to adjust the CapEx prior to the auction, as well as to provide information for the players that want to compete on the auction and to propose bids so that they can see what was already studied and they can do their own homework. So you can't license what you didn't plan for. And environmental foresight is a fundamental part of solutions. And at EPE, we have a transmission team and an environmental team that work closely together. And I think this is the last slide. So we actually try to build consensus and not just circuits. So at EPE, we have open stakeholder participation. We split Brazil into 6 national transmission study groups involving utilities, state energy agencies, investors, and the TSOs to discuss the needs of demand, where it's growing, where we have more potential for generation, and to program the studies that need to be made. All technical reports are publicly available at EPE's website, from single line diagrams to the whole simulation and socioeconomic justification for each solution. And that gives clear signals that create investor confidence. So every transmission auction in Brazil has been fully contracted since 2017, and well-structured auctions attract healthy competition and consistent discounts. In the last 5 years, we had an average of 40% discounts on the total yearly revenue that was allotted for the bids. So transparency builds trust with investors and with society. So I think that's it. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions later today.
Obrigado, Luca, for this presentation. Very insightful. Actually, a lot of lessons learned from EPE were also the foundation of the Workstream 1 of the Global Coalition for Energy Planning. So the Workstream 1 is on planning to investments. I'd like now to move to the panel discussions there. So I'd like to invite Cornelia Schenk from OECD, Dennis Volk from the Federal Network Agency of Germany, Alvin Jose from SE4All, and Luca, you are back up, also so from EPE Brazil. And we have also Arturo Alarcón from IDB virtually. So we have again virtual participants. Arturo, I hope you can hear us well.
I can hear you well. Thank you.
Yes, and similar to the first session, if you can, yes, perfect. Have your camera up. We'll start this panel with short opening statements for which I would like to ask you to keep under 3 minutes. One of my colleagues will show you a small paper if we need to wrap up there. Let's start maybe with Cornelia from OECD for your opening statement on essentially we would like to hear about how your institution is addressing the planning to investment gap in Greece, and from your analysis and work, which risks are the most pressing.
Thank you very much to the invitation to this conference. And for some of you, it might be surprising to see the OECD here on the panel. But I'm working for the Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Program, which focuses and supports emerging markets in mobilizing private finance and investment in clean energy projects. That includes renewable energy, energy efficiency, industry decarbonization, and also green hydrogen. And we work along 3 pillars in strengthening regulatory and policy frameworks, increasing the availability and the effectiveness of blended finance, of de-risking mechanisms and other financial instruments, and also strengthening domestic green financial markets. And our program is very much demand-driven, so we work with partner countries' representatives, and in a context where we heard already there are a lot of grid bottlenecks, public investment in grids is the dominant model worldwide, and in 80% of emerging markets the case. And also power utilities are financially constrained. A lot of governments are looking into options of how to mobilize investment in their transmission grids, particularly. So we started with a number of knowledge exchange workshops, inviting countries with a lot of experience in mobilizing private investment. For instance, Brazil, but also colleagues from India, from the UK, France, etc. And we started analyzing different financing models. Because when moving away from a public sector investment in transmission grids, governments and policymakers also have to consider the different options that are available for mobilizing investment, and what that means in terms of implications, or what changes to the legal and regulatory framework needs to be taken, how much of an effort on the part of the government is needed to actually move towards such financing models. What size of investment needs exist that would justify such a move, etc. So there's a lot of considerations around that. And also our analysis showed that biggest risks revolve around the uncertainty of policy and regulatory frameworks, but also around revenues, of course. Counterparty credit risk and political or sovereign risk is another big topic. There are also risks related to project development, which were mentioned before, which could be land acquisition, right-of-way, permitting timelines, etc. And then, of course, there's maybe not so much of a risk, but the challenge of finding a good balance between the right tariff and affordability.
Thank you, Cornelia. Actually, I will, after ask you the opening, maybe some lesson learned of the recent forum on green finance and investments. Moving on, maybe I'd like to turn to Dennis Vogt and the German Federal Network Agency.
Thank you very much for having us. In the German case, we consider electricity as a service which is fully funded by its users. So basically, it's a question of how to channel the costs into tariffs that consumers can pay them. And there, the regulatory framework and institutional framework comes into play. I work for the German energy regulator, which is the one-stop shop governmental institution for the network development. We are involved in the planning, and we are also involved in the cost approval and tariffication. There, the 2 frameworks are the most important aspects when it comes to delivering transmission and also distribution infrastructure. We have started a long way back already implementing that framework. So that's also a message I'd like to convey here. This is nothing when you decide about it, you want to have it. in your country that turns out overnight. We have started to implement the economic regulation with regards to cost approval and tariff allocation in the year 2005. It took us certainly 2 years until we arrived at a reasonable, good system which was able to control costs, but also set a system in place which was fine for the investors, the private investors. It took us another 2 years or 3 years to figure out that grids are super important for the what we call the Energiewende, the energy transition. So building renewables and grids have to be aligned. So we started by the year 2010 with setting in place a long-term transmission infrastructure planning framework, where we have the role of approving this, working together with our TSOs, approving the plans, and then linking these two regulatory building blocks, the plan and the economic regulation, in a way we have never done before, with anticipatory foresight, something a regulator really fears. Approving costs where you don't know what the real costs are and whether you need these investments really to happen. But we have done it, and it has to be, it has proven to be a very relevant factor in attracting the private capital we need. Obviously, we also heard about this. There's other aspects, and once again, super important also to have it from our perspective internally within our institution, the land use permitting processes. We have gained a lot of speed in delivering these infrastructures just by having it all together, because it reduces the coordination efforts a lot.
Thank you, Dennis. We'll deep dive on a few aspects you mentioned after the opening. Turning maybe online, Arturo from IDB. Dennis mentioned the capital needed to invest in grids. Can you share some opening statements regarding the work you're doing with your members?
Yes, and thank you. Good morning from here. Thanks a lot for the invitation. As you know, IDB is a multilateral development bank. We work across Latin America in 26 countries. Transmission planning has advanced in this region. There are many countries that have planning and long-term scenarios that provide a clear view of where capacity will be needed. However, the pace in which these scenarios become investable and executable projects is still slower than is required. We have a report and analysis that will be presented at COP, where we analyze specifically transmission in the region. And what we've seen is that the challenge is not just planning, but it's institutional. How do we translate these plans into regulation and these plans into bankable projects? We've seen some good examples in the region. Brazil is one of those. It was already presented. Chile and Peru, they have linked planning with competitive processes to expand transmission. Chile and Colombia have already regulatory frameworks that provide predictable remuneration ex ante to the projects, which is key. And there are some pilots for grid enhancing technologies and for innovation in the region. But we also have seen that these elements are not yet aligned in all countries, and that the speed required of the deployment of transmission is not yet there. In many cases, plans are not realistic. The times of the projects included in the plans are not realistic. So we have plans, but these plans are not really executable. We've seen that regulation is not consistently used to translate planning into bankable signals. And permitting and social, that was already mentioned, add uncertainty to the process and add delays. And finally, innovation, grid enhancing technologies and other supporting technologies are not embedded into planning and the regulatory practice. So the practical proposal and the practical lesson learned from the region is we need to work to have plans that are realistic and that can be executed. And that means improving the planning process itself, including the risks into the planning process and including the governance into the planning process. to have regulation that provides clear and predictable risk signals for investments, and to have projects that reach the market already structured to be bankable. That's for an opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's very good, let's say, elements. We're starting to see a common thread around permittings, around risk and risk allocations. Moving on, turning now to Alvin Jose and SE4O.
Thanks, Simon, and good morning to everyone. Thanks for having SE4All here. For those who don't know, SE4All is a UN-based initiative. We are headquartered in Vienna, and we primarily work with the developing countries to help them achieve their SDG 7 goals. This is 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. Of course, all of this aligning with the climate actions that countries have set themselves out to achieve. Very specifically on this, SE4All has been in the past 3 to 4 years, we have developed a few programs called the Energy Transition Investment Planning Program and also the Integrated Energy Access Planning Program. Essentially, what we do in this is we help out countries to solve a couple of questions in terms of their planning. That is, number one, how do they essentially make their national energy transition plan that is over-encompassing not only the power sector, but of course, a lot of the large sectors that will be expected to electrify in the future. So a lot of the demand side is being captured in that. And another major question, of course, in a lot of the countries that we work in, there is significant access deficits. A lot of that has to do with the lack of network augmentation, but also it is also a lot to do with the payback ability of the people that there are themselves. So it's kind of a reverse, cyclical issue and like a chicken and egg issue. Very specifically, when it comes to networks, maybe I can start with why we are not seeing that many. Just to build off a colleague from IDB mentioned, why we are not seeing that many planned to bankable projects. One of the things that we have noticed, we have worked across 5 to 6 countries in Africa, in Caribbean. Right now, we are doing an ASEAN regional roadmap. We are working on one of the biggest public sector utility of India, the National Thermal Power Corporation as well. What we have seen is that when it comes to network extensions, the planning is mostly around the amount of lines that are needed, the amount of MVA that is needed, what kind of distribution transformers is needed. The second major part of okay, what is the kind of investments needed, and very specifically, how do you really get that investment, the financial aspect really flowing? That's at a planning stage is really not there. So you don't have the financial people and the network planners sitting together and kind of trying to solve these questions together. That is the first thing that we have noticed. Second thing, it feels like a lot of the countries essentially are working on 2 models. One is that there is a revenue confirmation where there is some sort of wheeling charge or some sort of a revenue mechanism that has been already developed, and they kind of work backwards from that to plan how they want to set up their system. Or then there are sovereign-backed projects which are really clear. It has been seen that sovereign-backed projects, especially on high voltage lines, are still interesting, and a lot of backers and international players on PPPs come in and are able to do that. But the real issue is actually how do you get that transmission into the distribution? And at the distribution level, we see a lot of problems because ultimately, there's where it becomes a bit murky, because sometimes what happens is that they could be under the utility, they could be independent networks, and the utilities are very sick in most of the countries that we look at. There's a lot of leakage in terms of their own losses. They are not able to get back their own revenues, and they have a cyclical debt issue. So you are looking at a situation where you want these big projects and investors to come in and invest, but there are systematic losses. There are regulatory catch-ups that really need to happen. So it's not only about an investment. There is a marketplace. There's a regulatory catch-up that the country has to do at the same time. While at the same time, you are seeing record numbers of renewable projects coming into these countries. They are really stressing the grids, high amount of curtailment. So yeah, I think there are multiple folds of things that needs to happen, and I'm happy to kind of dive into that as we go along.
Thank you, Alvin. How are your thoughts? Yes, happy to deep dive on those elements. Lucas, we heard obviously your opening statement before, but is there anything you'd like to add? For example, we talk about maybe specific risk EPE has identified and addressed in the work on auction, for example?
Yeah, I think my colleagues here already talked about it's not only transmission, and it's not only a model that fits for all. Everyone needs to see their own needs and how to build the whole framework around what you have, the transition, and what you need, or actually what you need and want. So we have this model in Brazil for 25 years. So we are on a good streak from 2017 and onwards, but we had our own growing pains. We had years where we didn't procure all the lots. We had empty lots. So the project got delayed. We had to get back on the table to study what was the risk, what was the problem that investors didn't have the confidence to bid on that lot. And sometimes it was an environmental risk. Sometimes it was the allotted time frame for the construction of the project. Sometimes it was the technical solution that it didn't have the right capex. So that involves, I think, the last slide of building consensus on actually hearing what the problem was with that project, going back and seeing what was needed to be tweaked, if it was that particular solution on what area, or if it was the rules of the game that didn't fit the right moment that we were in. So for example, 25 years. In 1999, most of the projects were linked to the dollar because we had Plano Real online for 5 years only in Brazil. And prior to that, we had hyperinflation. So we had contracts that were linked on the long term with the dollar for adjustments. And right now we have only adjustments in reais, in the local currency, and inflation, because we saw that that was a problem at the beginning, and then we tweaked it when it was no longer a problem. So I think that you have to actually listen and see what the players in your country really need.
Thank you very much. I think that's also something very relevant. The currency risk also faced by Brazil in the phase of hyperinflation. I'd like to maybe ask some deep dive questions. And Cornelia, I mentioned the recent October 2025 Green Forum on Green Finance and Investments. That brought together investors, multilaterals, regulators to discuss infrastructure investment challenges. And from this perspective on policy making, could you share with us insights that emerge on what investors and the financial community needs when designing business model for those specific projects, the green infrastructure project?
Thank you very much. So first and foremost, predictability. We mentioned already a few times the stable and regulatory framework conditions that are relevant to make sure that the grid planning and how the grid will evolve is aligned with policy objectives and policy scenarios in the long run. Because what is interesting to investors and particularly institutional investors is stable returns over a long period of time, up to 30 years. Etc. So there really needs to be some certainty over the whole time frame. Also, the notion of grids has changed from a static asset towards now being considered platforms for change, for flexibility, for decarbonization, and they can provide a strategic growth potential for investors, which is very interesting. But for that also, what is needed is a clear and credible remuneration model. So clear tariff methodology, an independent regulator who helps with oversight of the sector, Brazil is actually a good example where remuneration is based on the availability of power lines and not on the actual power flow, which reduces also the demand risk and is interesting for investors. Credible payment security mechanisms is another point that is very important to reduce the counterparty credit risk. We've heard that many utilities are in a financially strained condition. I want to draw on one example from South Africa, who are at the moment setting up an ITP program, Independent Transmission Project Model Program. They're preparing their first auctions, what Brazil has been doing for the last 25 years. And also Eskom, the power utility, is in a financially strained condition. There was the need to unbundle the power sector. The National Transmission Company of South Africa was being set up, and they're at the moment establishing a credit guarantee vehicle with the National Treasury chipping in around 20% of a $500 million credit guarantee vehicle to de-risk private investments in the grids, which is a very, very important and interesting process to see how such a move from a public investment model towards a private investment can be implemented. As I said, we heard a lot from examples from Brazil. So we had actually Anil, the regulator here, also drawing conclusions very much in line with Luca, and highlighting another aspect that the contractual clarity is also very important for investors. And at the moment, for instance, countries like Brazil, but also others who have been implementing auctions for a long time, are now nearing the end of the concession contracts. And then there are questions around the maintenance, the continuous high quality maintenance of power lines and the transfer of transmission assets at the end of that concession period, or what happens next that need to be addressed. So there's a lot of issues to take into account and a lot of details that need to be addressed to create that investor security.
Thank you very much, Cornelia, for those insights. You mentioned obviously the role of utilities and their financial health, the credit risk aspects and the counterparts, and the new services that can actually improve certain projects like flexibility there. All those aspects obviously need to be discussed with different stakeholders in a national environment. And for that, I'd like to turn to Dennis. Dennis, you heard all those aspects, and obviously in Germany there is a mechanism that helps to coordinate. And could you share with us what institutional coordination mechanism has been most effective when translating planning scenarios into bankable grid infrastructure project?
Yes, the one-stop shop I mentioned before. I believe is very important in that respect, because what you need from an economic regulatory perspective is always the question: do we really need that project? We're about to invest 100 millions or billions of euros, or approve the investment into the future. Who planned this, and under what circumstances, what conditions, what are the details? We'd like to know before we sign off on that. Having these answers just in the next room, because it's all integrated in one institution, ensures that you can have these answers not only directly, but also with great clarity, and with also you are sure that you're both on the same page when it comes to the target. We all know that we can design, all of us can design a specific scenario for energy, and they all look different in the end. But what you need when you want to invest, you need certainty that you're building on the same scenario, basically. So having these two regulatory building blocks in one institution is actually quite helpful. It can be done also without. In Germany, we basically use both approaches because we like it very secure. So we do not only have this one-stop shop, but the minute we have approved a plan or a plan transmission, it will be transposed into law. So it's binding. It also can serve as a coordination mechanism, because once it's in the law, there's no way around, and there's clear roles and responsibilities with regards to how you use this plan and who has to use that plan. So that's I guess the two main factor.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So yeah, the one-stop shop is a very good example. I would say that many countries are trying to establish. It's not always easy, but I think the message also you share is about this help to build a secure and resilient in the energy system of Germany. Turning into Arturo from IDB. Arturo, obviously, beyond the pure, let's say, early assessment of project and the early discussion with the different actors in the investment cycle, investors and the banks, as a MDB, what and in your experience, what are the specific elements do investors require from planning processes to build what was mentioned here, predictability, certainty, and for them to commit capital for those long duration projects?
Yeah, that's a key question, I think, and it was already mentioned in some way in the interventions. We need not just the plans, but we need the regulatory certainty of income streams in some way. What we've seen in Latin America, there are good examples: Brazil, Chile, Peru. There are countries that already implement auction schemes, and they are successful in attracting investment. What do they have, regardless of how the sector is structured? They have revenue schemes attached to transmission. So you have the planning, but you also have the revenue schemes. The other key aspect is a clear risk allocation. It doesn't matter how good are our plans or how good is the regulatory scheme for the revenues. If you don't have a clear risk allocation on who will do what regarding the different risks, it's harder to attract financing. So what we've seen is you need to define, perhaps in the planning stage, who will be in charge of the different risk mitigation actions, whether it's permitting, whether it's talking with the communities, whether it is other aspects of the value chain, for example, that now has also become a risk aspect. So having those two, a clear revenue scheme and a clear risk allocation scheme, I think helps a lot to convert plans into bankable projects.
Thank you, Arturo. I think yeah, that's really the direction. And maybe for Luca, a question on this. No, so from the exercise of the planning exercise of EPE and their output, how can this output be translated into financial metrics that investors and the financial community understands to assess the viability and the economic case of grid infrastructure project in Brazil?
Well, I think in Brazil, with that framework, we have a culture of transparency. So,
Lucas, can you just put your microphone? Yes, thank you.
We have a culture of transparency. So all the reports prior to the auction, all the simulations, all the options that were studied are public. And even after the auction, we have public hearings prior to the auction. So investors can ask questions and we answer what can be optimized in the solution, if they want to change a thing or two, if it's allowed, if it's not allowed, and why. And after the auction takes place, we even share the metrics on the maximum revenue stream was calculated. So all the underlying assumptions of CapEx of project finance, it's all public, and they can check that with their own premises and ideas of project finance and see what was the mismatch, the cash flow, what was the discount that they could have provided compared to what was calculated. So to keep it short, in Brazil, we have a seal bid reverse auction. So we have the maximum revenue stream for 30 years of the concession. And the players, they bid, given discounts on the right to build, maintain, and operate those assets for those 30 years. So we have this competition. And if they bring into operation earlier, like we suppose it was a 5-year construction timeframe, and they managed to do it in 3 years, they received 2 years of extra revenue. So it makes a huge difference on the cash flow. So all that is public available, and they can check. And what we see in Brazil is projects coming into operation earlier.
Thank you, Luca. And that's a good example in Brazil. And maybe I'd like to ask the same question to Alvin, because obviously what was mentioned, transparency and making accessible information is not always the dominant, I would say, approach in countries. So is there experiences from the work of SE for All that help to essentially match the planning output to financial metrics to better or maybe accelerate the realization of green project?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have been trying to do is to look at, from a planning perspective, I can give an example. So we did an analysis on 3 countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya. Together, they would need to, for achieving, let's say, a low carbon or a net zero network by 2050, need to install around 200 gigawatts or 220 gigawatts of transmission and distribution. I mean, you're looking at almost around $100 billion of investment alone. But the more important aspect there is to really identify how do we really break this down. A lot of this is kind of assuming that there's going to be a lot of central evacuation. So for a lot of the countries, I agree with what Luca mentioned. It has to be really context driven, right? Because first, what they'll have to at least the countries have done is that they first try to address access issues through potentially, let's say, mini grid projects. And these mini grid projects, in many ways, needs to be concessional at some level, but they will need to be kind of really linked well with a good grid interconnection plan, a very good, let's say, economic viability program around all of this, and really backed by a strong regulatory and tariff structure. When it comes to a lot of the countries in the emerging economy side of things, we look, for example, in India, there are so many moving pieces there. There is a very good layout of the transmission network already, but the distribution network is like really trying to juggle between how to strengthen its or expand its current distribution network, while at the same time make sure that renewables, which are typically on must-run status, each and every electron gets evacuated. Over there, we see a lot of opportunities for investments in demand flexibility. So we have actually worked with around 4 states of the government of India, where we have helped them to draft their demand flexibility regulations. What it does is that it gives very specific targets for the utilities or the distribution licenses under these regulators for them to flex the load. And that's basically a kind of a grid deferral kind of a system, essentially, because there is a incentive and a disincentive for the utilities if they don't do it. We are looking at a lot of participation from storage players who are trying to not only benefit from arbitrage, but also coming into as a system flexibility providers as well. A last, I would say, example that we have seen is from a planning perspective is that transparency is key, of course, but I think more importantly, what is really happening is there is a institutional coordination that is really missing, and it feels like in a lot of the countries that we work with, it is very ad hoc. It goes from certain political regimes into the next. And what it really requires is, I think, like Germany has set up like a act or a regulation, like which transcends time and political realities. Yeah, that's how I would stop. Yeah.
Thank you, Alvin. Very comprehensive. I think that kind of also cover a lot of aspects we discussed before. Before we move off to the open question and the Q&A with the participants of the forum, I'd like to ask to everyone a similar question. The question will be what single adjustments in how grid plans are actually prepared would, in your opinion, have the greatest impact on turning what we mentioned before, the economic case to an investment case there? Who would like to start? I see Dennis.
For me, it's the institutional positioning of the plan. So you want to have a situation where you have one plan, another plan, and another plan. You want this one plan. And for that, every stakeholder who's involved needs to accept this plan. I was, from my regulatory perspective, of course, talking a little bit too much maybe about economic regulation and the role of the regulator in regulation, but also there's the role of the project developers who are closely involved in this plan, and they don't question this plan. They all know, okay, the cycle for planning comes up and I have my role, and they speak with each other. Policymakers have to buy into this plan. So that comes down to the question of, do you get your scenarios right? There's changes in the political directions, obviously, and then becomes an interesting balancing act, especially at a time when policies change or political directions change. So you have to factor this in and be able to do that as well as a plan. And transparency is important in the institutional positioning part as well, because if you want to translate that plan into reality, people out there won't like it and they will oppose. And only if you start engaging with them well in advance, if they feel they have a role in how this plan is developed, they are more likely to accept the transmission line in front of their backyard.
Thank you, Dennis. I see also Arturo on the screen now. I'm not forgetting about you. So yes.
No, thanks. It's the same question, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, from the IDB perspective, perhaps from a banking perspective, I think the key change in planning or the adjustment would be to include the risk allocation into the planning process. I think we need to see planning, regulation, financing, permitting as a single process. We cannot take each process separately. So when we see that as a whole process and we include the risk allocation perhaps earlier in the planning stage, then I think we can solve later problems and make easier the financing and the implementation of the project.
Thank you, Arturo. Who would like to intervene next? Luca, yes.
I'll change a bit the answer. I think in Brazil, and the main challenge right now, I think it's communication. I think we need to take these plans, take these solutions that we already have laid out, the 10-year expansion plan or the long-term plans, and how to communicate that with the lawmakers and the changing governments to make those adjustments that we also need into laws, into new frameworks for Brazil, so we can take these solutions that we already have, the plan solutions, the plans, the long-term scenarios, but the root correction for long-term on tariffs, on price signals, because in Brazil we have a saying, if you are a hammer, every problem is a nail. So sometimes we need to change the tool, and I think communication on how to translate these complex problems, these long-term scenarios for the lawmakers so they can make the adjustments and the route corrections for long-term is a challenge. And then we can create the best projects and manage the risk allocations, but we need a clear route for the long term as well.
Thank you, Cornelia.
Thank you. Maybe let me add to what Luca and Arturo have said. So the planning outputs from our perspective would have to be translated also into the financial terms that are needed. So not just saying what is needed in terms of grid expansion and modernization and under which time frame and what is the economic rationale, but how can this be financed? How can revenue be earned? And as Arturo said, also how are risks allocated? And we have, based on our partner government's interest, we are developing a publication around different financing models that could be applied by governments to finance their expansion and modernization of transmission grids, and the toolkit also what considerations, what criteria can be taken into account to decide which model would actually be suitable in the national context, and also what that implies in terms of the implementation modalities, what restructuring, what adaptations in the legal and institutional framework might be necessary, etc. Those are all very, very relevant considerations, and each of the investment models that can be chosen would imply differences in the effort that the government has to take to actually implement those models. So that's also critical considerations.
Last but not least, Alvin, would you like maybe to conclude, I would say, this question?
Sure. I'll try to finish it off with a bang. Well, I think one of the things that really has to happen is that because ultimately this is an investment and most of the times it feels like it is going to be at the end of the day a government-backed majority of investments really coming in, be it on a revenue-based model, be it on a concessional side of things. It just seems like a bulk of this investment has to come from the government. So I think right now it feels in most of the countries the investor or the Ministry of Finance is really missing in all these discussions from day one. They basically are informed about these numbers when the modeling is done, everything is done. Hey, by the way, you need to chip in 30% of this and expect a return on investment. I think that's going to be a bit of a difficult sell. So that is number one. So in a planning exercise, I think Ministry of Finances needs to be like really in from day one. And second is that I think there has to be like at least a list of bankable grid expansion projects with clear revenue models that the government really comes out and says, we have done all kinds of, and it kind of links into the communication part as well, that we have done all the kind of centralized planning, decentralized consultations. Everybody has this, and this is the kind of list of projects that we want to really work on, and this is the revenue-based model that we are going to be working on. These are the kind of guarantees that we give. It feels like that communication is still missing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alvin. I think that's really insightful. In the interest of time as well, I like to go directly maybe to the floor questions there. Also mindful of the online participants. My colleagues can collect questions, and I'm happy to enunciate them. Is there any first questions I would like to say? I see the gentleman here. Here. Okay, we can start, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your inputs. I'm Andrzej Ceglarz from Renewables Grid Initiative, and I have a question. You're mentioning about different risks included in the planning which are then translated into financeability of projects or the system. Can you share some insights about the climate risks that you are including into the planning, looking from the perspective of long term, but also low probability but high impact events, and how this is evolving within the last years, plus how the perspective of the insurance sector is contributing to the financeability of the entire process? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question and a theme that is very dear to me. So I work in the transmission planning at EPE. We already have a great number of publications about climate risks in the planning in Brazil. And specifically to your question, the distribution and transmission companies, they have a permission to characterize if there was an extreme event and have that problem of service to not be penalized. So they can characterize if it's a severe rainstorm and if it's approved by the government that was an exceptional risk. They do not take full responsibility for not supplying energy, and there are some mitigations there. It's an old rule. We have some discussions on changing it due to the increasing number of events and the time of disruption that we have been seeing. We had some problems in Brazil, in São Paulo, I think in 2023. But we also take that into planning. So we had severe droughts in the northern region in 2023 and 2024. We did a transmission solution specifically tailor-made to that problem. It was the worst drought in 100 years. And we had huge risks on operating those assets there. We did not face any interruption, but we were very close operating without any backup on N criteria, reliability criteria. So we actually developed a solution, talked a lot with the transmission, with the operator, the system operator, and we created a solution that's actually being auctioned 2 days from today, I think this Friday. And we have several documents about the communication, climate risks in the power sector. It's all public on the EPE website with each climate risks for transmission. We have a 3-4 page fact sheet with information, all the climate risks that we see in Brazil for the transmission assets. And then we have one for each source. So how do we see climate risks on hydropower plants in Brazil? What are the main things that come into play with climate risks and hydroelectric power plants? And solar, thermal, biomass, and wind. So we're actually building this communication and this understanding with society about climate risks in all the power sector in Brazil.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to react? Yes, I think you're the head of division of energy system resilience. Yes.
Well, resilient power systems go a long way already. So there's 2 components. One is the way you plan and what kind of scenarios you factor in, and under what kind of scenarios you'd like your service to be maintained and uninterrupted. So the N-1 principle that you build for these kind of shocks is one part of the answer. Obviously, then the other one is the question, okay, how do you harden your specific individual assets against changes in the climate and also other factors, other threats which are there? There is standards for this. There's technical standard committees we are using, and they apply then to the build out of all grids, and they are developing over time. So that's the short answer. We know that there is an issue out there, but we are not completely unprotected. There's always been weather. It's always been a factor. It's just the question of whether the standard, whether you allowed in your plan, will be the same in the future or not. That's still to be discussed. You know?
I will allow just to jump in, because what was mentioned in the introduction, how the network is also deriving maybe not to work with climate modelers. And I think that actually there is a room to work with climate modelers, because the system planning and energy planning should be aligned with the scenarios of climate. So, at least to my knowledge, in most of the countries in Europe, I don't know how it is in different parts of the world, this climate aspects included in system planning are based on historical data, not on the future data. And that brings a huge constraint into the planning of the future system.
It's changing right now, but you're right.
Arturo, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. No, I totally agree. I think it's a great question. And we did an analysis of the planning of transmission in Latin America, and we saw that most plans still are deterministic. So in the long term, they still consider in some way a few number of scenarios, like 6, 10 scenarios, and most of them are not climate scenarios. Most of them are demand scenarios, fuel cost scenarios, technology cost scenarios, and we need to change the whole planning approach from a deterministic to a probabilistic planning process, where we do consider climate scenarios, which are probabilistic. We don't really know what's going to happen. And then we need to produce robust solutions in some way that will work well in the different uncertain scenarios. And there was a second part of the question that I think we skipped to answer, which is how insurance companies or how financial models can help to build resilience. And I think that's the key question. I cannot answer in terms of insurance, but in terms of financing resilient systems is different, because you might have a higher capital cost up front to have a cheaper economy, like to have a stronger economy in the long term. So we need to find different financing models that enable for these resilient investments to happen in the short term to enable all these benefits in the long term. And if we don't do it, we will have a more expensive system at the end when these climate risks become climate events.
Thank you, Arturo. I think we probably need a resilience LTS forum to tackle those aspects, very important. Moving on for the Q&A, there was a gentleman with the red shirt asking, and then there was a person at the back, and then two at the front, at the back also, sorry, table.
Hello, my name is David Omata. I'm an Alexander Van Humboldt Climate Protection Fellow, currently hosted by the Africa Policy Research Institute. My question is on cross-subsidization, and any of you can answer. I want to know how or if you are leveraging on cross-subsidization to make your grid planning to become bankable. And I'm asking because in Nigeria, we are practicing this cross-subsidization for tariffs, but those that are in the class that's supposed to cross-subsidize, more are moving from the grid day by day. So they now prefer to have this rooftop solar, which maybe on the long run is definitely going to affect it. So if you are expanding the grid or you are planning, are you leveraging cross-subsidization, and how is it working in your country?
Thank you for the questions. So we're looking at, you mentioned the distribution systems with the rooftop solar, perhaps?
I mean, I cannot represent a country, but certainly at least what I can give is a few examples of what I've seen in cross-subsidization. It's a very, yeah, you're correct. It's a very prevalent thing. More for all, it is more, I've seen it as a more prevalent thing to kind of essentially get back the returns on investment in generation projects. We have seen certain wheeling charges being higher for certain kind of consumers, mostly commercial and industrial consumers. In Southeast Asia, what we are seeing at least is that there's a the new high demand centers such as like data centers, or it could be like sector coupling opportunities when it comes to electric vehicle charging infrastructures, etc. There's a lot of demand there, and we have seen system planners basically allow these big demand aggregators to come set up their demand, utilize cheap renewables, and actually pay higher wheeling charges if it was needed. So we have seen some of the system planners, or at least the utilities kind of go into that model. So we have seen this in Southeast Asia at least. There is again the example of Southeast Asia. There is a lot of sovereign to sovereign exchanges happening. So for example, you are looking at Lao PDR having direct PPAs with Vietnam, correct? And that kind of those lines are able to pay off a lot of internal distribution costs for long period, right? Like you do see that. So it is one of the models that we do see around at least in the emerging economies. Not so much in the least developed countries where it is still a lot of issues are more around plugging in the losses and leakages, etc.
Thank you, Alvin. In the interest of time, because there is a difficult decision, there is 4 questions between us and the lunch. So I propose that we take the questions in a row, and then we can respond to some of them with the panel. If we're not answering all, I suggest you meet together in a table to finalize discussion. So maybe we can take the first question here, and then we go. Also, there was a question on the side. Thank you.
Thanks for the insights. James Glynn is my name. I'm CEO and founder of Energy Systems Modeling Analytics, and until recently I was a research professor at Columbia in New York. But I'm also the coordinator of the energy protocol in the EasyMIP project. So EasyMIP is the intersector intermodal comparison project, which is run out of the Potsdam Institute down the road. And it's linking energy systems models with Earth systems models, and part of it is to create a data platform that links the hundreds of terabytes of climate data and outputs it in a useful way for energy systems models. So it'd be great to talk, but for the practitioners, we've been working over the last couple of years to make data sets that translate like wind speeds to capacity factors, and you can literally just put a can't think of the word. You can download your own country's capacity factors for the future SSP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for RCP 1.9, 2.6, 4.5, and 8. So you've got a matrix of 9 different scenarios. And we published a piece of work last year in Columbia where for the US, where you very much see wind speeds in the Midwest totally changing when you take this into account. And therefore you don't want to build transmission from the East Coast into the Midwest. You want to put your transmission offshore. It totally changes your results when you take into account those wind speed changes, especially after 2060 or 2070. Resource potentials can change in the order of 15 to 20%. So it's more of a statement than a question.
Yes, thank you so much. Let's move to the other questions. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much also from my side. My name is Evangelos Panos from Polsarian Institute, Switzerland. And I would like to share something a challenge that we have in Switzerland regarding the grid investments, and I would be interested to hear your opinions. It's also the responsibility in the case of a blackout. Who takes the responsibility for the energy security? And of course, the TSO is responsible for the adequacy and the operation of the grid. And then we have the DSO, who is responsible for integrating the renewable energy. But with the sector coupling, the boundaries between the two are blurred. And if the responsibilities on who takes the ownership of this challenge are not clear, then this can delay investments from both sides. So I would like to hear an opinion on that.
Thank you, Evangelo. We'll take the question from close to the window, and there was another question, I think, and then we can ask the colleagues. This one was on energy security. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Ana Amaso. I work at Tetra Tech, an engineering and consultancy services company working with many countries in actually implementing energy planning approaches for more resilient systems. My question actually builds on what Mr. Jose said before on data centers. So in your view, how is your work as planners, as regulators, changing in thinking about the planning system, seeing these loads and thinking about how to evaluate the resulting transmission grids, grid reinforcement, but also cost allocation implications that emerge from these new type of loads? Thank you.
We'll have actually a session on new demands loads coming up, but if any of the panel would like to intervene. Last but not least, the last question, and then we can ask the colleagues to.
Yes. I'm Diana Perez from XM, Colombia. Do you think that could regional integration contribute in any way to improve the planning in long and medium term? Or do you think that is a matter in more individual way for countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for those. So the topic of grid integration there. So we had energy security, new demand, which I propose we park because we have a full session on those aspects tomorrow, and then the aspect on grid integration and the vision there.
Well, I'll start with the data set for the future. We do have some talks in Brazil with a simulation we call time series lab. We take some of that data of wind, solar, and plug it into our generation models to see the behavior in the future. About the blackout, from my colleague from Switzerland, in Brazil, if we're talking about a single blackout, like a day, something happened and 4 hours we went without energy, the ONS, the Brazilian system operation, takes full responsibility. It requires all the agents, the transmission operators that are in the affected area to provide data. They do several meetings to analyze the data and create a specific report explicitly stating what were all the problems that led to that blackout. But if we are talking about an energy blackout, like we didn't have enough energy to meet the demand for a long term, actually EPE was created because of that lack of coordination between operators. Like in 2004, we had a severe drought and an energy blackout in Brazil. We had to mandatory energy reduction for households, and that it's not the operator that takes responsibility. It's the Ministry of Mines and Energy due to a lack of planning. So right now we have EPE for that, to see those risks, to map out those scenarios. We always have the risk. We have the risk of no supply in Brazil, and we take that into consideration because we have 2,000 synthetic scenarios for hydropower plants in Brazil. So we have some droughts, but it's the government that takes responsibility. And when we see that we are heading that way, we try to course correct, to take actions prior to that to alleviate the stress on the consumers. And I'm not sure the question from Colombia. Between countries, right? Yeah, in PDE at EPE, the 10-year plan, we have a specific session about grid integration in Latin America, in Brazil, with Paraguay, Argentina. We have Arco Norte, the Northern Arc in Brazil. We have challenges because when we're talking about cross-country integration, it's not only the technical aspects, but the diplomatic aspect as well. We have Itaipu, that's a huge hydropower plant, and it's binational with Brazil and Paraguay. And we need to have several talks. And I think one of the main challenges in Latin America is the change of governments. We have to build a deep understanding for the long term to actually be able to build interconnections and new interconnections, be it with transmission or be it with generation, because it's a huge project for all the countries involved.
On the risk allocation with regards to the blackouts, maybe the way I look at it right now, we are not in a situation where we face blackouts every month, but they are increasing in their frequency. Having said that, in Europe, there is a process every time we have faced a blackout with major consequences on a European level, where an expert assessment panel is sitting down and analyzing all the data. It happened, or it still happens, with the blackout we have seen in Spain, but there's others as well. There's a governance framework for that. And in the end, you will, in most situations, end up with a clear identification of whose fault it was. And then you can actually, of course, talk about the risk allocation when answering this question. But that's the framework which applies. So I haven't come across an investor saying I don't want to invest because it's too uncertain with me. I'm risking to be the one who manages or whose actions result in a blackout. Obviously, the rule books have to be clear, and maybe we see in the future a situation that the rule book wasn't clear enough. So there are two institutions looking at each other and saying, "Okay, I thought you were responsible, but." Haven't seen it yet. Luckily. With regards to the data centers, it's factored into our assessments on demand developments. But there's uncertainty with regards to data centers, with regards to location, with regards to the amount, etc. It's all part of the process, and we don't do our assessments and estimates in isolation. It's an open, transparent thing. So that's the only answer. And there's times we get it wrong, of course. Yeah.
Thank you, Dennis. Arturo, you have to maybe give us a concluding remark in less than 1 minute. I trust as a banker, you're efficient and smart. So the floor is yours.
Well, without answering the questions, then I think the concluding remark will be that we need to see the whole grid problem or process as a whole, including planning, regulation, financing, permitting, and innovation, without leaving resilience and climate risks out of the equation. So I think if we consider all of that chain as a single process, we will improve grids and renewables.
Thank you, Arturo. Congratulations, less than 1 minute. So I like to conclude these discussions before the lunch. First, thanks to the panel. I think that we discussed that capital will follow certainty, and the translation of the economic case to the case hinge on predictable long-term regulatory frameworks. And this certainty is built around transparency. We heard about examples like auction design, coordinations, whole of government in Germany. The second, also we discussed about how we are moving beyond just building lines. I think we are creating new markets and new structures that can enhance the investment case for green infrastructure. The emergence of flexibility was mentioned. And last but not least, the scenarios are not anymore about only least cost pathways. We heard about the emergence of resilience and the aspect of energy security. And those are no longer co-benefit because it was mentioned when there is an event, you have to build again the infrastructure. So that will be exciting insight, will flow into the discussion both on the LTS network, on the technical level, but also on the political level with the Global Coalition for Energy Planning on the road to COP30. And thanks again to the panel for their insights and contribution today.